There was no map that showed the stairwell behind the staff door at track 3 of the Red Pines station. It wasn't marked in any internal guide, and no one ever mentioned it during the brief training sessions they called orientation, but it was there. Behind a rusted grey panel labelled with a faded stencil, P, the metal door opened with a long groan and a staircase led down into concrete silence. 3 levels below the station, the air shifted. The noise of trains and announcements disappeared, replaced by something still and low like the sound inside an old vault. I took that staircase for the first time on a Monday in late March. It was raining. In my hand was a sealed envelope with 2 keys, a printed entry pass, and a short instruction. Report to Sector P3, 1600 hours. No signature, no job title, no contact name. At the bottom of the stairs was a narrow corridor. Grey, poured cement, lined with flickering tube lights. It went straight for maybe 20 meters and ended at another door. This one was heavier, with a keypad and no label. I used one of the keys. The lock clicked. The room behind the door was colder than I expected. Not cold like winter, but cold like something had been untouched for too long. Metal shelving units ran along the walls, all filled with folders and binders thick with dust. In the center stood a heavy desk bolted to the floor. On it sat a monitor, an old logbook, a paper folder, and nothing else. The only chair creaked when I sat in it. There was no one else in the room. I opened the logbook first. Most of the entries were dry. Inventory dates, scanner maintenance, unusual camera interference. But near the middle of the page, written in firm, mechanical handwriting, was a single line that stuck out. Do not engage with identifiers from Category C. Visibility does not confirm presence. No date, no initials. The next day, I met the man who apparently oversaw the department. He introduced himself simply as Mr. Carter. Tall, narrow frame, clean-shaven face, eyes that didn't blink often enough. He didn't ask me anything, just pointed to a different monitor and explained how the alert system worked. Cameras rotated through dormant tunnels and inactive service branches. If motion appeared, I was to document it, save the footage, mark the coordinates and label the anomaly. Unless, he said, the identifier matched the list. He handed it to me after that. A laminated sheet, slightly yellowed, printed in block letters. Across the top, Category C, exempt identifiers, do not acknowledge. Beneath that, 20 entries. 5, 147, A3309, M712, KP1188, Z/N, others just like it. Random, cryptic. I asked what they meant. Carter didn't hesitate. Decommissioned units, he said. Scrapped, deregistered, or unconfirmed. Unconfirmed? They were scheduled for destruction or reassignment. Some never completed the process. Some show up. Your job is to ignore them. No recordings, no logs. If it appears, you look away. He didn't say it like a joke. There was nothing light in his tone, and I didn't ask again. The first 5 shifts passed without incident. I drank instant coffee, scrolled through static feeds, filled out weekly paperwork. Sometimes I reviewed accident reports from decades ago, misdirected signals, tunnel collapses, workers going missing in sealed maintenance shafts. Nothing more than old paperwork, but the laminated list stayed taped beside my screen. On the 6th night, at exactly 11:46, the monitor chimed. A motion alert from Branch 5, Camera 11. Identifier 3309. I didn't move at first, just looked. Then looked again at the list, 4th from the top. The feed was grainy, the tunnel was dark, but something was coming down the tracks. I saw headlights, faint and flickering. A slow, steady approach. A train, 4 cars, no interior lights, no visible passengers. The paint was dull, like metal left to rot. I started to reach for the keyboard and stopped halfway. The rule was clear: do not engage, do not record. The train moved through the camera frame, smooth and nearly silent. It didn't stop. It coasted into a dark side tunnel, then halted. The headlights dimmed, one by one. And just before the feed cut to black, something shifted inside the front cabin. A shadow, taller than it should have been, leaning forward. I pulled the power from the monitor. The room went silent, except for the hum of the wall vent. I couldn't hear my own breath. That night I didn't sleep. I sat on the edge of my bed with the light on, trying to convince myself it had been a recording error, a feedback loop, a glitch, but I knew better. The next day, I arrived early. Everything was quiet. The monitor powered up normally. Branch 5 showed nothing. By the 8th shift, Carter didn't show up. He never said much, but that night, he wasn't even in the building. At 10:23, another alert, this time from Platform Echo 2. Identifier 1188 Z/N. I recognized it instantly. Near the bottom of the list, that platform had been shut down over 15 years ago. But there it was, 1 car, no markings, windows dark. The camera angle showed a figure standing on the platform. I stared at them, still, facing the tracks as the train passed. Slow, like it was gliding. The person didn't move. But then they turned, not toward the train. They turned and looked directly into the camera, and they smiled. I pulled the monitor cable again, this time harder. The light in the room flickered. The silence pressed in. I didn't stay the full shift. I left a note saying the system had failed. At home, I opened an old browser and searched the identifier. Nothing. I tried the platform name. Found one result, a message board from 6 years ago titled "Things You're Not Supposed to See," red loop. The first post was 3 sentences long. I saw a train at Echo 2 last week, 1 car, no lights, it didn't stop. Someone waved at me from the inside, but I don't think they had a face. It was like static behind glass. There were no replies. I closed the laptop. The next night, I went back anyway. I unlocked the same door, sat at the same desk. Watched the same monitors. At 11:51, the screen lit up again. A new number, 712 KP, and it was coming toward me. I sat there for several minutes just watching the screen. The identifier read 712 KP, glowing faintly red in the corner of the interface. The camera feed it was tied to showed a narrow, sloping tunnel section I had never seen before, not in the schematics, not in the logbook diagrams, not even as a name in the archives. The walls were concrete but warped slightly as if they had been exposed to pressure or heat. The light inside the tunnel didn't come from mounted lamps, but rather from the train itself, a beam so narrow and cold that it didn't reflect against the walls. The train moved slowly, more like it floated forward than rolled, and no sound came through. There were 4 cars, but only the first one showed signs of any use. The windows were dark, not black, but the kind of grey that looked like it had soaked in time. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I just watched as it crept past camera 16 and slid out of view. It didn't stop. It didn't signal. It didn't exist. I turned off the screen. Not the power switch. I pulled the cord from the back panel with a slow, deliberate motion, the same way you might remove a needle from your skin Without looking at it, I leaned back in the chair and listened to the silence. It had a weight to it that wasn't normal. The hum from the ceiling vent was gone. The air felt thicker. I could hear something faint, almost like an old radio signal, distant and muffled, but nothing in the room made that sound. I told myself it was stress, maybe a pressure headache, maybe even lack of sleep, but part of me knew that wasn't true. The room was different now, not visibly. The shelves were the same, the papers in the same place, the fluorescent light still flickered, but the atmosphere had shifted in a way I didn't know how to explain. After that night, I didn't sleep. I tried. I laid in bed for what must have been 5 or 6 hours, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw that identifier flashing at the bottom of the screen and the dim outline of that train moving without friction, without sound. My dreams became tunnels. Not nightmares, just tunnels. Endless, quiet, lightless. I'd wake up feeling like I hadn't returned, like I'd left part of myself somewhere behind a locked gate. I didn't report any of it. I followed the rule. No documentation of Category C identifiers, no mentions in the logbook, no camera stills. When Mr. Carter asked me 2 nights later if I had seen any anomalies, I said no. He looked at me for several seconds, longer than usual, then nodded. He turned to leave, then stopped just before the door and said, almost in passing, "Sometimes they stop appearing because they've already seen you." He didn't explain what that meant, and I didn't ask. I stood in silence for almost an hour after he left. The next shift, I began to notice things that weren't part of my job. The chair felt slightly closer to the desk than I remembered. The calendar on the wall, one that hadn't been flipped in months, now had 1 page torn. The second drawer of the filing cabinet was open by less than an inch. Not wide enough to look inside, but wide enough to be wrong. I closed it, but the next day it was open again. Always the same drawer, always the same angle. I didn't find any signs of someone entering. The archive door had a mechanical lock. Only I and Carter had keys, as far as I knew. At midnight on the 5th night after the last train sighting, I noticed a sound. It wasn't coming from the camera system, it came from the back corner of the room. A soft, mechanical click, like the sound of a tape deck shifting. There were no machines in that corner. I stood up slowly, keeping my hand on the edge of the desk, and turned to look. Nothing was there, just the blank concrete wall and the storage shelf marked "Retired Circuits." The air around it was colder than the rest of the room. I walked over, not sure why, and stood in front of the shelf. The folders were undisturbed. The tools still hung on their rack, but the dust looked different, not thicker, not disturbed, just wrong, like it had been set down again after being lifted. That night I didn't turn the monitor back on. By the end of the week I had stopped trying to rationalize any of it. There was a change in the way the archive felt, in the way the lights buzzed overhead, in the pressure behind my eyes. And then, during a particularly quiet shift, the silence broke in a way I couldn't explain. It wasn't noise, not footsteps or motion or the creak of metal. It was something internal, a shift in my own head, like the air between my ears had tightened. Then I heard it. A voice. Not out loud, not audible in the room. It was inside. Clear, direct and immediate. It said my name. Only once, not shouted. Not whispered, spoken with certainty. I backed away from the desk, knocking over the chair. I didn't run, I didn't scream. I just stood there, breathing through clenched teeth, staring at the blank monitor and waiting for it to say something else. But it didn't. Nothing moved. Nothing changed. I stood for maybe 20 minutes, barely moving, until the overhead light flickered again, once, then went still. After that, I sat back down and began writing a false report about a power fluctuation in Tunnel 4. I had to put something in the logbook. I didn't mention the voice, I didn't mention the name, but I knew what had happened, and I knew it wasn't over. I arrived the next night, 10 minutes earlier than usual. I don't know why. Maybe I didn't want to feel rushed. Maybe I needed to prove to myself that I was still in control. The hallway down to the archive level felt longer. The lights hummed lower. When I opened the door, I paused for a moment in the frame, waiting to feel it. The shift in the air that had started a few days ago, it was there, not stronger, not weaker, just constant. As if the room now carried a new atmosphere, not one I had brought in with me, but something that had always belonged here and was now finally showing itself. Everything was in place. The desk, the chair, the laminated list, the logbook. The second drawer of the filing cabinet was closed. I didn't test it. I knew it would be open again tomorrow. I sat down, turned on the monitor and checked the camera rotation. All systems reported as nominal. No alerts, no motion, nothing registered under any identifier. And yet, after a few minutes of just watching the rotation pass from one dead tunnel to another, I noticed a faint distortion in the timestamp at the bottom of camera 9. It flickered for a second, not the whole timestamp, just the hour. It blinked from 00 to 03, then back to 00. There was no motion on the screen, but the platform it showed, an old junction point near Bell Crossing, looked subtly changed. There were no passengers, of course. The station had been closed for over 20 years, but the third bench on the left side of the platform now had something on it, a small, dark shape. Not large enough to be a person, not shaped like luggage, just something. Like a bundle, but not wrapped. I stared at it for several seconds. It didn't move. The timestamp blinked again. I changed the feed manually. I spent the next 2 hours jumping between active tunnels and sealed corridors, trying to convince myself that I was simply working, following protocol. But everything in my body was angled toward avoidance. I didn't want to see that shape again. I didn't want to look at camera 9. One point, I got up and walked a slow loop around the archive room, as if checking equipment. But really, I just needed to hear my own footsteps. The silence was growing heavier. My ears began to ring faintly, like when a room is pressurized just slightly wrong. I sat back down, stared at the desk, and noticed something I hadn't seen before. On the edge of the laminated sheet, the Category C list, there was a crease, very light, almost imperceptible, as if someone had pressed a finger against the corner. I hadn't touched it in days. At 1:37, the lights above me flickered once and held steady. The monitor dimmed briefly, not fully, just a soft pulse, like a slow breath from a machine. I leaned forward and checked the log. No system faults, no electrical warnings, nothing official. But on camera 14, something began to appear in the top right corner. Not movement, just a presence, a shape bleeding in from the edge of the frame, like a figure stepping out of fog, except the fog was pixelation. Slowly, a shoulder, then part of a head. Not bald, not wearing a hat, but lacking detail. As if the image was being masked in real time. The figure turned toward the camera. There were no facial features, but it was facing me. It didn't move after that, just stood there, half in view, half out. I turned off the feed, sat back, breathed slow. The air smelled like rust. 10 minutes passed without change. then 20. The cameras showed nothing else. No identifiers. No motion. I didn't turn camera 14 back on, I just left it off. The logbook remained blank. At 2:33 I heard it again. Not a voice, not like before. This time it was my own, saying my name. But it came from the direction of the monitor, like a playback. A recording I never made. Daniel. One word, clear, in my own voice, flat, unemotional. Daniel. The second time quieter, I sat frozen. The monitor was black. I waited another full minute before standing up and unplugging everything. Monitor, power strip, backup station. Then I sat back down in silence and stared at the dark screen. My heart wasn't racing, I wasn't sweating, I just felt hollow. Like something had reached into the part of my mind I used for reason and tapped gently on the inside wall. At 5:41, I filed a routine report claiming no unusual activity and left. I didn't tell Carter anything, he never asked. The following day, I left my apartment around 6:30 in the evening and took the long way to the station. I walked past the southern overpass, down a road I hadn't used in years, cutting through the pedestrian tunnel just to delay arriving. The spring air was sharp but dry. I kept my hands in my pockets the whole walk. I knew I was going back. There was never really a question about that, but part of me had begun performing these unnecessary rituals, like if I arrived a few minutes later or crossed a certain street, I could shift the sequence of events waiting for me 3 floors beneath the tracks. When I reached the access door, I stood for a moment on the bottom stair, listening. There was no sound from the corridor. The lights above buzzed normally. The keypad accepted my code on the first try. When I opened the door to the archive room, the air inside was still. Not heavy, not cold, just expectant, like the room was holding its breath. Everything looked the same. The second drawer of the filing cabinet was open again, exactly 1 inch. The laminated sheet on the wall had no new creases, but I didn't check too closely. I sat down at the desk, powered up the monitor, and began my shift like nothing had changed. The first few hours were uneventful, tunnels dark, no movement, no identifiers. I even started to believe it might remain that way, that the strange encounters of the past week had reached their end. At 11:14, I took a break and walked to the far end of the archive to stretch my legs. I stared at the emergency radio terminal bolted into the wall, a backup system we were never supposed to use. The dust around it looked undisturbed. I reached out, brushed my fingers across the console and paused. The antenna wire had been unplugged, not cut, not torn, simply disconnected, neatly coiled behind the casing. I hadn't touched it. Carter hadn't mentioned any service reports. I reconnected the wire and returned to the desk. At 12:23, a motion alert appeared on the lower left corner of the monitor. The sound it made wasn't the usual soft tone. It was a deeper, slower pulse, as if the alert itself had degraded. The screen switched automatically to camera 10. The image was nearly black, but the infrared picked up something tall near the center of the frame, not moving, not clearly defined. Just standing near the platform edge of a station I didn't recognize. I zoomed in, adjusted contrast manually. The figure came into view slowly, like surfacing from water. It had no coat, no visible hair, no distinguishing outline, just the proportions of a person standing still, head slightly tilted toward the tracks. No identifier appeared. I checked the feed log. Nothing. No entry code, no train number. I stared at the figure for several minutes. It didn't shift. It didn't blink. It stood in the same position the whole time. The timestamp ticked forward 1 second at a time without interruption. Then, at 12:31, it raised one arm. Not abruptly, not dramatically, just a slow gesture, like it was hailing something down the tunnel. A second later, the motion alert disappeared. The camera went black. No error code, no transition, just gone. I waited. No sound in the room. No return of the feed. I checked the other tunnels, nothing unusual. But when I returned to the logbook, a single line had appeared at the bottom of the page, in handwriting that was not mine. Do not greet the waiting ones. It wasn't written with my pen. It wasn't written with any pen I had ever seen. The ink was slightly metallic, almost reflective under the fluorescent lights. I ran my finger across the line. It was dry. I checked the logbook from the day before. Nothing unusual. Checked the page again. Still there. I closed the log, locked it in the drawer, and powered off the monitor. I sat back in the chair, breathing slowly, watching the reflection of the emergency light above me pulse faintly on the metal cabinet. I didn't leave early. I stayed until 6 o'clock, not because I wanted to, because I was afraid that if I left before the shift ended, I wouldn't be allowed back out. On my next shift, I entered the archive with the weight of inevitability pressing down on me. There was no more doubt, no more rationalizations. Something had changed inside this place, not in the walls or the equipment, but in its attention. It had begun to look back. I no longer scanned the tunnels to monitor for accidents or record scheduled movement. I watched because the system was now a mirror, and something beyond the camera glass was beginning to press against it from the other side. When I sat down, the laminated sheet was missing, the Category C list. I had last seen it hanging to the right of the monitor, clipped with rusted pins. It was always there. Now the pins were empty. I checked the drawers, the floor, the trash bin. Nothing. I didn't panic. I didn't even feel surprised. It felt, in a way, overdue. The first hour passed in silence. I drank the same metallic-tasting water from the cooler. I kept my eyes on the logbook, but I didn't write anything. I didn't even turn on the monitor right away. It felt disrespectful, like turning your back on a patient who hadn't finished speaking. At 11:34, I powered it on. The feed came alive without delay. Camera 12 blinked in first, showing the same disused platform near the southern bend. Nothing moved, nothing blinked. But the timestamp was wrong, not corrupted, not flickering, simply wrong. It read March 20th, 1979. I knew that was impossible. The overlay pulled directly from the system clock. I opened the terminal log. It still showed the correct date, April 7th, 2025, but the image on the screen remained as it was. And then, someone entered the frame. It was a man, middle-aged, wearing a navy blue uniform with silver trim, an old transport marshal outfit, long outdated. He walked into the platform slowly, holding a small clipboard, his posture tired but purposeful. He didn't look toward the camera. He didn't speak. He walked to the end of the platform and stopped. He looked down the tunnel for a moment, then turned and checked his watch. His mouth moved. One word. I couldn't hear it, but I knew it was a name. Not mine. Someone else's. A name spoken from memory. Then the image froze. No error message. No system blink. Just a still frame. The timestamp began to tick forward again, but the man didn't move. I watched for another 10 minutes. Still nothing. At 11:47, the feed switched itself. It moved to camera 3 without my input. There was no motion on the screen, but the station it showed, Maple Line Transfer, had a new detail. A train sat on the far track. No lights, no engine noise, no identifier, just their unscheduled, unregistered, 4 cars painted pale grey. I zoomed in manually. Every window had been painted over from the inside, except for one, near the rear. Through it, I saw a face, just one, pressed against the glass, not distorted by movement or light, perfectly visible. The eyes were open, wide, staring directly at the lens, not angry, not pleading, just watching, not blinking, not moving. I stood up and stepped back from the desk. The image didn't change, the camera didn't flicker. It felt like I was being asked a question, not out loud, not with words, just held in place, examined, measured. I stayed like that for 5 full minutes, then the face slowly leaned away from the glass, retreating into the shadow. The feed cut to static, and the room fell silent again. I sat back down, did not breathe for several seconds, then opened the logbook and wrote a single line. Do not respond. That night when my shift ended, I didn't go home. I took the first outbound service train, rode until the end of the line, and stayed on the bench at West Terminal until sunrise. I didn't sleep, I didn't speak. I just waited until enough normal people surrounded me again to feel real. But I never really left, not after that. By the time I returned to the archive 2 nights later, I had convinced myself I would no longer be affected. Not out of bravery, more like resignation. You can only be startled so many times before your system accepts that fear is just another background frequency. The keypad blinked its usual green. The door opened with its familiar resistance. But as soon as I stepped inside, I realized something had shifted again. The lighting was too even, the shadows were too still. And the air, which had always smelled of old wires and underground dust, now had a faint sweetness to it, like decaying paper soaked in cheap perfume. The kind you'd find in the lost and found bin of a provincial train station. I closed the door behind me, slower than usual, and didn't turn on the light right away. Just stood there, listening. There was a new sound, faint but constant. It came from behind the filing cabinets, a soft scraping, like fingernails dragging across worn metal, not sharp, not aggressive, just slow and steady, in rhythm with something I couldn't place. I walked toward it, not trying to be quiet, not pretending I was in control, just moving forward because the not knowing was worse. As I reached the second cabinet, the sound stopped. Completely. The silence that followed felt hollow, like it was waiting to be filled again. I opened the cabinet door. Empty, nothing out of place, just blank folders, dusty circuit sheets, unused cable ties. I closed it. The scraping didn't return. I sat down at the desk and stared at the monitor for a long time without powering it on. Instead, I opened the drawer and pulled out the logbook. The line I had written, "Do not respond," was still there. But beneath it, in that same reflective ink I had seen earlier, was a second line. "You already did." I closed the logbook immediately, slid it back, and pushed the drawer shut harder than I meant to. The impact echoed in the quiet room. I stayed motionless for a few minutes, then I powered on the monitor. It booted normally, cycling through the cameras. The timestamp was correct, the feeds were quiet, but I no longer trusted that meant anything. At 12:21, camera 8 flickered. It showed a tunnel segment that should have been sealed for maintenance. The report last week had stated clearly, total closure due to structural shifts, but now the tunnel looked operational, clean. Too clean. The walls had no soot, the tracks gleamed faintly, and on the far wall, illuminated by the emergency strip lights, was a new sign. one I had never seen before. Platform D, indirect services. I zoomed in. The paint was fresh. The sign had no dust. The screws were not rusted. And there in the corner, beneath the mounting bracket, was something small and red. A tag. Fabric, like from a uniform. It moved slightly in a breeze I could not feel. I checked the tunnel logs. No mention of Platform D. No reference in the archive. I opened the old binder from 1968, the one with the faded grey cover and broken spine. Platform A, registered. Platform B, discontinued. Platform C, used only during Cold War diversion drills. But D, nowhere, and yet there it was, clear as breath on glass. I left the camera running and turned to the filing cabinet again. This time I opened the third drawer, one I had never touched before. Inside were 3 folders, unmarked. I pulled the first one. Inside, a single sheet of paper, yellowed, typed on an old manual machine, slightly crooked. It read, "In the event of activation, indirect services will resume under modified protocol. Operators must remain inside the archive. Do not engage. Do not follow. Do not leave the room until the echo has passed." I didn't understand most of it. But one line stuck with me, "Do not follow." I looked back at the monitor. Camera 8 now showed an empty track. The sign was gone, no trace of it, no tag, no platform, just tunnel, as if it had never been there. But I knew what I had seen, and I knew somehow it had seen me too. The next morning I didn't go home right after the shift. Instead, I sat in the break room upstairs, next to the unused vending machine and beneath the flickering emergency light that had never been repaired. I didn't eat, I didn't drink, I just sat there and tried to map the sequence of events in my head, as if this entire experience could still be reduced to misfired equipment, stress-induced hallucinations, or poorly documented urban planning. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw that sign. Platform D, indirect services. The paint was too fresh, the air in that tunnel too clean. It had not been a ghost image or some projection from the past. It was built, it was placed, recently. By someone or something with access no living person should have. I finally got up when the sunlight started creeping through the thin window on the upper floor. That light felt almost offensive, as if it didn't belong to the same world I had just spent the last 6 hours in. But I walked through it anyway, pretending it still mattered. For the rest of that day, I tried not to think about the archive. I washed my clothes, I bought groceries, I spoke to a neighbor about the plumbing in the building, nodded at the right moments, even smiled once when she told me about her cat getting stuck behind the washing machine. But everything I did felt like it was happening on top of something else, like a second skin of reality was trying to peel away beneath the surface, and all my actions were just delaying the inevitable reveal. Around 5:30 in the afternoon, I finally gave up and walked to the old library on 6th Street, the one with the stone columns and flickering track lighting no one had bothered to fix since before the pandemic. I asked for blueprints. The woman behind the counter looked confused but obliging. I gave her the year, 1979. She returned 20 minutes later with 2 binders, both worn and filled with folded oversized sheets. I spent the next 3 hours flipping through them. The Bell Crossing Junction, the Southern Bend, the long decommissioned North Extension. Nowhere, absolutely nowhere, was Platform D mentioned. Not even as a proposed expansion or an unfinished project. Just blank space. At exactly 8:15, I found something strange. On the third page of the Southern Main Line schematic, there was a hand-drawn annotation, faint pencil, partially erased, that looked like a fourth corridor branching off where only 3 were documented. There was no label, no dimension notes, just a faint arrow pointing south, and the letters IS scribbled in the margin. I sat with that for a long time, then I took out my phone and searched the phrase indirect services along with the station name. Nothing came up, no incidents, no archival photos, but there was one forum post from 2 years ago, now deleted, cached only in fragments. It read, "He waved at the empty track, the wrong track. He said he was catching the indirect. I never saw him again." That was all. No username, no replies, just a dead line on a dead page. I walked home with that sentence replaying over and over in my head. I knew what I had to do, not because it made sense, but because my shift was coming. And I knew in my bones that Platform D was waiting for me again. I arrived that night just before 11. I didn't take the longer route this time. No detours, no attempts at hesitation disguised as caution. I walked the exact same path I'd taken for years, the one I used before the rules began changing. The archive door greeted me with the usual resistance, but the silence behind it felt fuller, not louder, just more present. Like something was waiting, not with anticipation, but with patience, the kind of patience that doesn't belong to the living. I turned on the overhead light and paused by the filing cabinets. The drawers were all shut this time. I didn't open them. I walked directly to the desk, powered on the monitor, and waited for the feeds to stabilize. They did, for a while. Camera 8 came online just after 11:15. There it was again. Platform D, only this time the image didn't flicker. The lighting didn't hum. The angle was slightly different, as if the camera itself had been moved a few feet to the right. That had never happened before. No one accessed these tunnels, not without clearance. And I had been the only one with the keys since Carter stopped showing up without explanation. On the far edge of the platform, partially obscured by shadow, was something new. A bench, just one, made of wood, not metal, unpainted, worn smooth like it had been used for decades. But it had not been there 2 nights ago. I zoomed in. Something rested on it, not a person, not a bag. Something in between, like a bundle of folded clothes, but the shape was wrong, too uniform. It looked more like an empty uniform arranged to resemble a sitting posture. I stared at it for a long time. It didn't move, nothing did, but I had the distinct, irrational sensation that it had been placed for me, deliberately. An invitation or a warning. At midnight sharp, the lights on Platform D flickered once, and a train entered the frame. No sound, no wind. It simply appeared from the left side of the camera's range, rolling in like it had always been there, like it belonged. 4 cars, grey paint, no numbers, no windows, not even headlights. It came to a complete stop, perfectly aligned with the platform. The doors did not open. I felt the hairs rise on the back of my neck. Not from fear exactly, more from recognition. This was the same train I'd seen before, the same one that had watched me. And I now understood something I hadn't before. It was not arriving. It was returning. I stood up slowly, not taking my eyes off the screen. I didn't speak, didn't breathe too loudly. I stepped back, toward the radio on the wall. When I reached for it, I saw something even more impossible. The power cord had been severed, not unplugged, cut, cleanly, precisely. No fray, no sparks, just 2 perfect ends. I stared at the break in silence, and then, from the monitor behind me, I heard a soft knock. 1, 2, 3, not from the speakers, From within the image itself, a knock against metal, like someone tapping gently from inside the fourth car. I turned slowly. The camera feed was still. No movement, no doors, but I could feel it now. Something behind that metal shell, pressing outward. Not violently, just reminding me it knew I was watching. At 12:05, the train began to roll backward. Smooth, silent, it disappeared off-screen in reverse. No smoke, no sound, no vibration. And then the feed returned to normal. The platform was empty again. No bench, no uniform, no platform D.
Just tunnel, just track, just darkness, as if none of it had ever happened. But I knew better now. It wasn't showing me these things by accident. It was preparing me. The next day, I stayed in bed far longer than I should have.
The curtains were drawn, the phone was turned off, and the only sound in my apartment was the occasional shift of the building's old heating system, groaning like something mechanical that didn't want to be alive anymore. I watched the ceiling and waited for a thought to settle long enough for me to hold on to. But none came. Everything inside me felt scattered, not from fear, but from an internal dislocation, like I had been pulled out of step with the rest of the world, and each hour I remained above ground was simply a pause before the archive pulled me back in again. Around 3 in the afternoon, I stood up and forced myself to eat something. 2 boiled eggs, black coffee. It tasted like water and clay. Then I sat by the window and watched the city move on without me. When I finally opened the logbook again later that evening, I'd brought it home 2 nights ago without even realizing, I noticed something new on the inside cover. A small circular stain, as if someone had placed a wet glass on it. But I hadn't.
I hadn't drunk anything near the log, and yet the mark was there. I touched it with the back of my hand. Dry, faint, and around its edge, barely visible, were 4 tiny notches, evenly spaced like teeth marks from an old key or gear.
I flipped to the most recent entry. My handwriting was where I had left it, but beneath it, once again, someone had added a sentence. "You're almost ready." No name, no ink I recognized, just those 3 words. I didn't sleep that night. I went in early, arriving at the station just past 9. The corridors above the archive were empty. No janitors, no late engineers, not even the echo of a distant footstep. I descended alone, using my own set of keys. I didn't trust the keypad anymore. The door opened on the first try. Inside, everything appeared untouched. The lights still flickered in the back corner. The cables still looped across the floor in uneven curls, but the monitor was already on.
No power surge, no timer, just glowing, steady, as if it had never been turned off at all. And the feed it showed wasn't one I recognized. This time, there was no tunnel, no platform.
Just a room, bare concrete, walls marked with surveyor chalk, a single folding chair in the middle. A chain hung from the ceiling, not attached to anything. The lighting was uneven, as though the image came from a degraded analog tape. At first, I assumed the camera was malfunctioning, but then the timestamp appeared. December 3rd, 1951. I stared at it for several minutes. The room didn't change, no sound, no movement, no indication of where this space even existed. Then just before 10 o'clock, a man walked into frame. Middle-aged, slightly hunched, wearing what looked like a railway operator's vest. The kind used before the metro system was fully electrified. He carried something under one arm. A book, maybe. He walked to the center of the room, stood in front of the chair, and looked directly into the camera. His lips moved, no audio, no transcript.
But the moment his mouth formed the shape of the second syllable, I recognized something terrible. He was saying my name. Not once. Over and over. He said it slowly, like a ritual, deliberate, certain.
And then he reached into his pocket and placed a single item on the floor beneath the chair. It was a key, rust-covered, small, too small for any modern lock, and yet I felt with absolute certainty that I had seen it before, not in person, not in dreams, but on the archive wall. In an old photograph from the 1960s, partially torn, showing the original control room with a chain hanging in the background, and something small, red, in a technician's hand, the same shape.
The same metal. He said my name once more. And then the feed cut to black. Not static, not error, just a black screen. And in the upper right corner, a new label appeared, Category D. There had never been a Category D, not in the manual.
Not in the training logs, not in Carter's notes. It didn't exist. And now it did. I spent the rest of that shift staring at the black screen. No new feeds appeared, no static, no flicker. Just that single label in the corner, Category D, glowing faintly, as if backlit by something far beneath the visible spectrum. I didn't touch the keyboard. I didn't write in the log. My hands rested on my thighs the entire time, palms open, like I was waiting for something to fall into them. At some point, I stopped watching the monitor and began watching the room itself, every small detail, the cracks near the baseboard, the torn insulation around the power conduit, the discolored square on the wall where a map had once been pinned. It all felt staged, like the props of a play I hadn't realized I was part of. I stayed like that until the hour struck 6, when the lights blinked once and the monitor powered off by itself. No shutdown sequence, no beeping, just silence. I left without turning anything off, without closing the drawer, without locking the door. For the next 2 days, I didn't return. I called in sick, which no one questioned. There were no supervisors left to question it. The department had been shrinking for years, quietly dissolving into automated systems and outsourced contractors who never saw the inside of the tunnels. But I didn't rest. I paced my apartment until the floorboards began to creak in new patterns. I opened every box in my closet, every drawer in the kitchen, searching for something that might explain why I had been chosen. But of course nothing surfaced, only memories. And the more I tried to piece them together, the more I began to doubt their accuracy. Had I really worked here for 7 years? Why couldn't I remember Carter's first name? Why did my personnel file have no hire date listed? I even checked the Metro's HR portal. My profile existed. Photo, name, station code. But under start date, there was a blank. I returned to the archive on a Thursday, just after sunset. The entrance corridor smelled different, like rust, wet rust. I followed the scent down the service stairs, my footsteps softer than usual. Not from caution, just habit, the kind of step you take when you know you're being listened to. When I reached the archive door, I didn't touch the keypad. I knocked. Once. Twice, then opened it with the key. The lights inside were already on. The monitor was off, but the desk lamp was glowing, and I had never owned a desk lamp. It hadn't been there before. It was old, green-shaded, the kind you'd find in a library reading room from the 50s. Its light pointed directly at the logbook, now opened to a blank page. A pen rested diagonally across the page. Not my pen. I never brought one in. And beneath it, faintly written in the upper margin, were the words, "Only what is documented can be forgotten." I stood there for a long time. Then I sat down, picked up the pen, and began to write. Not a report, not a log entry, but memories. Things I hadn't remembered in years, the sound the platform made during drills when I was a child, the feeling of standing too close to the yellow line long before I ever worked in this place. The voice I once heard in a maintenance tunnel, low, not hostile, but speaking my name with perfect pronunciation. I wrote for nearly an hour. When I stopped, I looked up and saw the monitor had turned itself on again. No camera label, no date, no signal, just one word centered in white letters, entry. And beneath it, a blinking cursor. I waited. And then, without input, the screen began typing. "Do you wish to proceed?" I didn't answer the question, not immediately. I just sat there and stared at the blinking cursor like it might blink itself away if I gave it enough time. But it didn't. It pulsed steadily, patiently, like a metronome that had no interest in urgency. The phrase, "Do you wish to proceed?" felt both literal and metaphorical, as if it wasn't asking me to press a key, but to make a deeper choice, a personal one. I looked around the archive room and saw nothing had changed, and yet everything had. I could no longer see this space as a collection of objects or wires or old maps. It had become something else entirely, a waiting place, a filter, maybe even a mouth. I reached for the keyboard, placed my fingers on the keys and typed yes, not in all caps, just the word, small and clean. The cursor paused for 3 seconds, then vanished. The screen went black. Then came the hum, low, subterranean. Not audible in the usual sense, but more like pressure behind the ears, like when you're too deep underwater. The light from the desk lamp began to dim, not all at once, but in steady increments, as if someone was slowly dialing the voltage down. At the same time, the filing cabinets began to rattle, not violently, but with rhythm, measured, intentional. I stood up. My breath caught in my throat, not from fear, but because something in me knew this was the point beyond which nothing would reset. There would be no returning to routine, no forgetting, no, just a job. I walked to the far wall, the one behind the old conduit that had never been fully patched, and I saw it, a small metal hatch, flush with the concrete, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. It hadn't been there before. Or maybe it had, but I hadn't been ready to see it. The hatch had no handle, just a keyhole, and I already knew which key would fit. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the object I'd taken home without thinking 2 nights prior, the one from the filing cabinet, dull brass with a triangular tooth. I hadn't remembered slipping it into my coat, but there it was, as solid as the floor beneath my feet. I inserted it into the lock. It turned with no resistance. The hatch released a soft exhalation of air, as if something behind it had been waiting a very long time to breathe again. I opened it slowly. Behind it was a narrow corridor, not wide enough to walk through comfortably, but just enough to crawl. The walls were covered in black dust, and the smell that came out wasn't decay or sewage or old metal. It was memory, sharp, damp, human memory, the canteen, the kind that smells like burnt paper, wet stone, and unfinished stories. I didn't hesitate. I got down on my knees and crawled in. It wasn't bravery, it was inevitability. The tunnel led downward, not in a spiral, not at an angle, just down, like a chute that didn't want to end. I couldn't tell how long I crawled. There was no light, no echo, no variation in temperature, just motion and breath. And somewhere around the place where time started to lose shape, the tunnel opened into a chamber. I didn't stand. I just sat back on my heels and waited for my eyes to adjust. The room was spherical, not natural, but not fully manufactured either. Its walls were made of concrete, but the texture was wrong, like it had been poured against something soft. In the center stood a chair, the same kind I'd seen on the monitor, folding, metal, with something small resting beneath it. The key, the same one, or another of it. And on the wall behind the chair, written in letters the height of my chest, were the words, "Observation becomes function." I whispered the phrase aloud, not to remember it, but because some part of me knew it was meant to be said. As soon as I spoke, the chamber lit up, not from bulbs, but from the walls themselves, glowing faintly with a cold, milky light like the underside of ice. And now I saw them. Dozens, maybe hundreds, of tiny openings, each no wider than a coin, arranged in patterns that pulsed faintly in rhythm with my own heartbeat. Or were they adjusting mine? Something was watching me, not with eyes, not with intention, but with design. And I understood, finally, that Platform D wasn't a location. It was a threshold. I don't know how long I stood there. The light wasn't stable. It pulsed just slowly enough to suggest passing time, but without offering any scale. Maybe it was 1 hour, maybe 12, but I stayed. The phrase on the wall began to lose its meaning after a while. I repeated it in my head so many times that the words detached from each other. Observation becomes function. What did that mean, exactly? That the act of watching created purpose? Or that by observing, I had become a part of the system? I looked at the chair again. The small key beneath it hadn't moved. I knew it was meant for me. I stepped forward and crouched, reaching for it. The moment my fingers touched the metal, the temperature in the chamber dropped, not just by degrees, but like the entire space had been removed from heat altogether. My breath no longer produced mist. My pulse slipped, not from fear, but as if my body was being recalibrated. Then I heard a sound I hadn't expected. Breathing. Not mine, not above me, below. It wasn't labored or monstrous or exaggerated. It was steady, human, precise. Someone, or something beneath the floor, was breathing in perfect rhythm. And it wasn't hiding, it was waiting, not for escape, but for acknowledgement. I stood slowly, the key in my hand, and looked for a seam or panel or opening beneath the chair. There was none, only concrete, but the sound continued, not louder, not closer, just constant, as though it had always been there, and only now had I earned the capacity to hear it. I whispered, "Who are you?" But no reply came. Instead, the walls of the chamber shifted just slightly. Walls. Not with movement, but with presence, like something large had just leaned in toward the space without entering it. I backed away from the chair, still holding the key, and as I did, one of the small openings on the far wall opened wider. Not mechanically, not like a door, like an eye. Behind it was not darkness, it was film, a moving image, shaky, handheld, of a hallway I knew, the archive, my archive. The camera moved forward step by step until it turned the corner and faced the back cabinet. The top drawer slid open, slowly, carefully. Inside it were photographs. Dozens of them, all of me, but not at work, not in uniform, at home, as a child, in school, laughing on a street I hadn't walked in decades, all in black and white. I pressed closer. The feed shifted. One of the photos came into focus. It was me standing by the metro gate, age maybe 8 or 9, holding a small metal train in one hand. I remembered that toy. I had thrown it away when I was 13, but in the photo it was pristine, new, in my grip like it belonged there. And on the back of the image, barely legible, were the words, "Accepted, Category D, Behavioral Echo, Stable." The film flickered, the eye closed, and the room fell silent again. That's when I knew I hadn't been hired, I'd been selected. I did not speak again for the rest of the time I remained inside that chamber. Not because I was afraid, though there was fear, dense and quiet, but because I knew that words would not belong here. This space was older than language, older than job titles, safety manuals, or inked logbooks. I had been brought here not to record, but to remember. And memory had its own gravity. I sat in the chair. The key now rested in my pocket, heavier than before, though it hadn't changed shape. The moment I settled my weight, the light dimmed to a dull silver tone, and the wall in front of me, the one opposite the eye, became a screen. No words, no interface, only my own face, not a reflection, not a mirror. But me, sitting in a room I had never seen before. Same posture, same clothes, except the version of me in the image was smiling, and I wasn't. That version lifted one hand slowly and placed something on the table in front of him. A cassette tape. Old, labeled in red wax pencil, Tunnel B, Cycle 7. He pressed play. There was no sound, but I heard it anyway. A voice, clear as water underground, speaking inside my chest instead of my ears. It said only this: "You were observed before you were born." Then the feed ended. The wall went blank. I tried to move, but the chair seemed to hold me with more weight than my own. Not resistance, just expectation. I looked down and saw that my hands had begun to darken at the fingertips, like I'd been handling coal or graphite. But it wasn't staining, it was something deeper. My skin wasn't dirty, but it was changing, becoming part of the material around me. I pressed my palms to my thighs and felt heat. The room was warming. Zzz. Not unpleasantly, but in a way that made the bones inside my arms throb, as if some current had awakened behind the flesh. I knew then, with certainty, that this process could not be reversed, that I was no longer just an employee in a forgotten tunnel. I was being absorbed, not killed, not even erased, translated. The chair released. I stood up. My legs responded, but my steps no longer felt like my own, not unsteady, just untethered. I walked toward the far side of the chamber, where the curve of the wall seemed less perfect than before. And there it was, a new corridor, lit faintly from beneath, like it had been carved by footsteps instead of tools. I followed it, not because I wanted to know more, but because I had already agreed. The tunnel curved upward, softly, like a gentle slope toward a shoreline. The walls grew smoother, the air less cold. And soon, the space opened into a familiar room. The archive office. But it was empty, not deserted. Empty, as in untouched. No cables, no monitor, no desk, no door. Just the shape of the place I had once known, recreated in absence. I turned and saw the metal cabinet. Only one drawer, open. Inside it, a stack of papers, blank, except for the first. It read, "Document what remains, then close the drawer." My hands moved before I could think. I took the pen that hadn't been there a moment ago. I began to write, not thoughts, not explanations, just what I saw. The light, the breathing, the key, the eye, the film, the words. I filled 12 pages, then the pen stopped working. I placed it down, closed the drawer, and the room vanished. When the room vanished, it didn't dissolve. It folded, like a sheet of paper being tucked into an invisible envelope. First the walls bent inward, then the corners pinched softly, and finally the space where I had stood was gone, replaced not by darkness, but by nothing. Not the absence of light, not a void, just the distinct awareness that I was somewhere with no coordinates. I could feel my body, but not the space around it. My feet touched no floor, yet I didn't fall. My hands hung by my sides, yet there was no gravity. And then, from far ahead, or far inside, came a voice. But it wasn't a sound, it was a pattern, a rhythm of thought I recognized not as words, but as design. The voice said, "You are not the first, but you are the last to enter voluntarily." I didn't respond. I couldn't, not from fear or awe, but because I understood that responses were no longer relevant. I had passed the point where language was necessary. I was no longer being asked.
I was being used, not in a cruel way, in a deliberate one, like a cable meant to carry a signal or a tunnel meant to hold silence. I remained still. I waited. Eventually, something around me began to shift. Slowly, the nothing became shape.
Indistinct, murky, like the inside of a memory that had never been mine. A boy in a grey coat, a subway platform, a siren that only played when no trains were scheduled.
And always, always, the feeling that someone was watching from the tracks, just out of frame. Then, the return. Sudden, abrupt. I was back in the station control office, sitting upright in a metal chair I didn't remember approaching.
The desk before me was clean, empty, save for a radio and a folded map of the city's metro grid. But the map was different. The lines were wrong. Some had been removed. Others extended deep into sectors I knew didn't exist. Whole loops that curved into places with no names. One station was circled in red ink. It was labelled simply Echo Gate. I looked at the clock on the wall. It read 9:23. I had entered the archive at 5 o'clock 2 days ago. But it was Tuesday, and now it was Monday. My body ached in places I couldn't explain, the kind of ache that doesn't come from movement or injury, but from realignment, like something inside my spine had been rethreaded. I stood, unsure of what would happen next. No one came. The hallway outside was quiet. My phone was gone. My badge was still clipped to my collar, but the photo on it wasn't the same. My face was older, not by much, but enough that I noticed it. I returned home without being stopped. The elevator in my building worked, though I couldn't recall pressing the button. Inside my apartment, everything was as I had left it, except one thing. The logbook was on the kitchen table, closed, but warm. I opened it, expecting blank pages or another message. Instead, I saw a fresh entry. In my handwriting, dated 2 days from now, the title, "Known Anomalies, Do Not Archive." Beneath it, a list of station codes. None matched anything on the public grid. One of them was circled, B19. My pen was next to the book. I didn't pick it up. I just stood there, staring at the page, listening. Because in the silence of my apartment, just under the hum of the fridge, I could hear something faint. A train horn, coming from below. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't try. I sat at the kitchen table with the logbook closed in front of me, listening to the horn that never fully faded. It came in waves, soft, mechanical, like a train that kept entering the same station over and over without ever stopping. The kind of sound that seemed just beneath the world. I knew it wasn't in my head. I leaned against the floor, I pressed my ear to the parquet, and I heard it more clearly, not just the horn now, but the rumble of tracks, the squeal of brakes, the metal rhythm of a system no longer mapped. a line not found on paper, a loop without exit. At some point, maybe near dawn, I made my decision. I returned to the archive. I didn't bring a bag, no food, no phone, just my badge, the key, and the map. The station was empty, no commuters, no staff. Even the flickering monitors in the north corridor were blank. But the keypad on the archive door accepted my code. Same tone, same light. I opened it, and what I found was not the office I remembered, but something older. The room had been stripped bare. No desk, no cabinet, no screen. Just the chair, positioned exactly at the center, facing the far wall. The chair was turned toward me, not inviting, just waiting. On the wall behind it, a mirror had appeared. Not modern glass, not surveillance grade. A pane of tarnished metal, dull and uneven, the kind you'd find in an abandoned train car. I stepped forward and looked into it, but the reflection was not mine. It was the same room, same floor, same walls, but in place of me stood a child. Thin,
pale, hair matted with soot, eyes blacked out, not with shadow, but with absence. And behind him, the outline of a train car without lights, without doors, just frame. I blinked, the reflection held. The child did not move.
but the air around me shifted, and the temperature dropped by several degrees. The logbook was on the floor now, open. One new page, just 5 words. Platform D is always open. I didn't ask what it meant. I knew what it meant. It had never been a location. It had been a state of readiness, of proximity, of waiting to be noticed. And I had noticed, not once, but again and again and again. Every time I heard the wrong bell at the station, every time a car passed through without stopping, every time a signal blinked red when the board said clear. Those weren't malfunctions, they were requests. Not all trains are for passengers. Some are for return, some are for record.
And some are for those who've seen too much. I sat in the chair. The door behind me closed. The room dimmed, and somewhere far below the mapped lines, the train pulled in, not with sound, but with memory, not for escape, but for entry.
I did not resist, because I was never here to leave. I was always here to remember. And now I am part of the archive. Should you hear the horn late at night and the platform seems longer than usual, do not board. Not all passengers are alive. Not all stations are real, and not all jobs are meant to end.